Let's get more reaction to this quarter and bring in Jared Weisfeld, the tech sector specialist at Jefferies. Jared, great to speak with you. Great to get your take on a day like today. What does Bob Swan need to do to help his company find its way?
That's a loaded question. So maybe just taking a step back, I want to hit on the point that Guy was just talking about, because I do think that the ASP, the average selling price issue last quarter was a big problem, right? Across the board, desktops were down 5% sequentially, notebooks down 10% sequentially, and data center, which is the key because that's really the profit center for this company, was down 14% sequentially. Now, to be fair, part of that was definitely a mix shift as enterprise and government really fell off the cliff in the quarter, down 47% year on year. But you're talking about the data center group, which is what investors are excited about, right? That's levered to all the themes that you want exposure to, whether it's 5G, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, machine learning. You know, their data-centric businesses were down 10% year on year, and they just got them down to be 25% year on year into the December quarter. So that mix shift of the business is not going where it needs to be. So from a Bob Swan perspective, I think you need to right the ship. And then there's the broader question of the strategic direction of this company with respect to process technology manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, manufacturing, that was a huge issue last quarter, and it looks like it's going to be a huge issue this quarter. And Bob Swan was quoted by Barron's just recently saying that they were still having yield issues on the front end of the fabrication process, Jared. And, you know, at one point, Intel was sort of the standard bearer when it came to manufacturing and this fabrication process. And here it is now. Would it be a good thing or a bad thing if Intel actually outsourced that for good?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think there's not really going to be a choice for them, just given the process technology leadership that Taiwan Semiconductor is taking, which is the world's largest foundry. They're progressing down Moore's Law to 5 nanometer and below with EUV technology, and TSMC and Intel is falling behind. So in the slide deck for the Intel presentation this evening, they talked about their commitment to 7 nanometer, and they're going to use the best process technology available to them. So that basically leaves the door open for them to go ahead and pursue the best process technology that's out there. And that's what AMD did, you know, years ago. They had the vision to shut down their fab footprint and really leverage the process technology leadership of TSMC. So at this point, time's running out, because at this point, AMD continues to gain share.
Hey, Jared,
so much for your time,
so
Jared.
You just hit out, though, on...
Tim, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. Ultimately, the question, Jared, though, is when I look at TSMC and I look at AMD, you know, they're probably, to me, relative to themselves, the other side of the valuation story. I'm just kind of curious, with TSM is one of the great stories in technology over the last 2 years in terms of the share price. Do you still think that there's room for that based upon valuation and all the spoils it seemingly has taken from Intel?
So from a TSM perspective, I think the question is, are they the last man standing in process technology? If Intel gives up on process technology from a leading edge manufacturing perspective, which is a loaded question in itself, because then there are national security implications. Does the U.S. government even let that happen? But assuming that goes down that path, you know, I have to imagine that investors are going to receive it pretty positively from a TSMC perspective when you think about accreting that multiple, if they really are the last manufacturer of basically being able to progress down Moore's Law. So I think it becomes, you know, a very close monopolistic situation where if Intel leaves the roadmap, then it's TSM's market share for the taking.
Jared, thanks so much for your time. Quick question: do you see any in the short to medium term, any additional divestitures or sales of assets to shore up cash, or perhaps a strategic acquisition?
So listen, I mean, from an Intel perspective, they just sold the NAND flash business to SK Hynix for $9 billion. And they also engaged in an ASR, an accelerated share repurchase, to go ahead and repurchase their shares. So, you know, if you're Intel, I think the message needs to be clear. We need to sort of, you know, fix the house before we start acquiring assets that are looking to help from a strategic perspective. You know, it's going to be tough for Bob Swan and company to start making large acquisitions while their business is declining like this. So I think, you know, they're focusing on the core. They've already divested the NAND business. At this point, you know, they're focusing the business on DCG and everything levered to that growth going forward. I think it becomes tough for them to do an acquisition in the context of where fundamentals are right now.
Do you think this is a turnaround story, Jared? Turnaround investment, or is it too early to say?
So, I mean, if you're Intel, the path should be clear. And listen, Bob Swan is like, he's no stranger to this, right? He was at eBay for a long time as CFO, and when you think about everything that he did over there from a value creation perspective, I think the path should be clear. You know, when you think about the strategic options for Intel in terms of thinking about their two main businesses with respect to process technology manufacturing and all of their factory networks, and then the design arm, is there something he can do longer term, whether it's a spin or anything else to help create value? So when you think about Intel as a turnaround story, you know, it's certainly possible, but it's a long road ahead because they really need to go ahead and figure out strategically where they want to be as a company longer term.
Jared, thank you. Good speaking with you. Jared Weisfeld of Jefferies. Tim Seymour, what would the question that you would have put to Bob Swan on the conference call if you could?
I'd like to know really their vision of manufacturing and where they plan to compete and where they're planning on outsourcing. I think the sentiment on data center is tough because it's their core, and it was weaker than expected in an environment where it could have been better. Although you know, again, enterprise and government pullback in the current environment, not a huge surprise. So I think people just look at Intel as a company that multiple times over the last decade has tried to move to the front of the leading edge of innovation, only to find themselves either making bad investments, especially as it went into mobile telephony and new chips, and now at the core of even the most generic, highly processed chips. They don't seem to have a game plan. I'd love to know where they're going with this, because data center clearly is not enough.
Jared had an interesting thought in terms of the national security issue potentially arising if manufacturing were actually outsourced to a company like a Taiwan semiconductor guy. Would that give you solace if you held Intel shares and heard that the government basically would put a backstop there, or no? Would that make you run even farther away?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's. Well, well, in terms of Intel specifically,
yes,
that's absolutely would placate and assuage some of the concerns. On a broader issue, though, it gets back to the whole thing we've been talking about, U.S.-China relations, and is that just one more is it arrow in the quiver of this battle we've been fighting, and is that finally the market finally wake up and be concerned about that? I don't know how to answer that, because the market clearly hasn't cared one way or another. I'll say quickly in terms of Intel, again, my sense is, I don't have it in front of me, AMD's probably higher on the back of this, and they report, I think, on the 27th of this month, which is next week. AMD is, it continues to illustrate the dominance that AMD's had over Intel for the last couple of years now, and I think that's going to continue.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.